Some warnings should never be ignored. But what happens when a doctor refuses to listen, only to realize too late that the very patient he dismissed holds the key to his survival? Let us know in the comments if you've ever had your concerns brushed aside. Vanessa Johnson sat in the sterile waiting room of Dr. Julian Carter's clinic, her fingers tapping against her purse with impatient rhythm. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, casting a clinical glow over the neatly arranged magazines, months old, untouched, just like the concerns of too many patients before her. The receptionist, a woman with stiff blonde curls and a tight-lipped smile, barely acknowledged her as she scrawled something into her notepad. "Ms. Johnson," the nurse called out, her voice detached. Vanessa stood, adjusting her blazer, trying to mask the unease settling in her chest. It wasn't the first time she had to fight for a doctor to take her seriously. It wouldn't be the last. Inside the examination room, Dr. Carter barely looked up from his clipboard as she took her seat. He was a middle-aged man with graying temples, his neatly pressed coat an extension of his polished, no-nonsense demeanor. "What seems to be the problem?" His voice carried the tone of a man who had already diagnosed her before she had uttered a word. Vanessa inhaled. "I've been feeling exhausted for weeks now. I get these intense headaches, and sometimes I feel dizzy out of nowhere. My joints ache, and—" Dr. Carter let out a small sigh, not one of concern, but of impatience. "Have you been drinking enough water? Getting enough sleep?" Her jaw tightened. "Yes?" He tapped his pen against the clipboard. "Stress can manifest in a lot of different ways. Work, personal life. It all adds up. I know my body," she said firmly. "Something isn't right." He finally looked at her then, studying her with an expression that was neither interested nor concerned, more like someone humoring a child. "Your vitals are normal. There's no reason to assume anything serious is going on." Vanessa's patience thinned. "I've done my research, Dr. Carter. I know these symptoms can indicate something more than stress. Can you run some tests?" His lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't see a need for that right now." There it was. That dismissive tone she knew all too well. The same tone she had heard when her aunt was ignored by doctors right up until the moment she was diagnosed with an advanced illness. The same tone her best friend encountered before being told, "We'll keep an eye on it," right before her condition worsened. Vanessa leaned forward, steadying her voice. "If I were someone else, someone who didn't look like me, would you be so quick to brush this off?" His eyes flickered with something unreadable, a moment of recognition, perhaps, before his usual composure slid back into place. "This isn't about race, Miss Johnson." "Then what is it about?" she pressed. A pause. His fingers tightened slightly on the pen. "Look, I don't want you to worry yourself unnecessarily. You seem fine, but if it makes you feel better, I'll prescribe something mild for the headaches, maybe an iron supplement, just in case." Vanessa's nails dug into the leather of her purse. She had seen this script play out before. A hand wave, a condescending nod, a half-hearted solution to pacify a patient he had already decided wasn't worth further investigation. She wasn't about to play along. "I don't need a prescription," she said, rising to her feet. "I need answers." Dr. Carter sighed again, like she was an inconvenience. "If you're that concerned, you can always get a second opinion." She held his gaze, reading everything he wasn't saying. He wasn't taking her seriously. He never was going to. "Maybe I will," she said, forcing a polite smile as she grabbed her purse. As she walked out of the room, the weight in her chest only grew heavier. She had expected better from a man with credentials like his. She had expected better from a field that was supposed to help people, but she wasn't surprised. In the hallway, the receptionist barely looked up as she muttered, "Have a nice day." Vanessa didn't respond. By the time she reached her car, her hands were already on her phone, searching for the nearest research center. If no one else was going to take her concerns seriously, she'd do it herself. And maybe, just maybe, she'd prove them all wrong. Vanessa sat in her small home office, the glow from her laptop screen illuminating her face as she flipped through pages of medical journals, case studies, and research papers. The frustration that had started in Dr. Carter's office had evolved into full-blown determination. She wasn't just looking for answers anymore. She was proving a point that should have never needed proving. Her symptoms weren't just stress. They weren't just in her head. She had found enough evidence to connect the dots. A rare autoimmune disorder that disproportionately affected Black women but was widely misdiagnosed or dismissed. And why? Because the medical community had a long, ugly history of ignoring Black patients' pain. She clicked on another article, her eyes scanning the symptoms, the patterns. It was all there. But finding the truth was one thing. Getting someone to listen was another. Her phone vibrated beside her. It was Maya, her best friend, a nurse who had seen this kind of dismissal play out in hospitals every single day. "Girl, tell me you got some good news," Maya said as soon as Vanessa answered. "Fine good news. I found a condition that matches almost every symptom I have. But getting a doctor to believe me? That's another story." Maya sighed. "You'd think by now they'd do better. But nope, same old garbage. Have you made any progress?" Vanessa leaned back in her chair. "I found a research clinic specializing in autoimmune diseases. I'm scheduled for an evaluation next week." Maya exhaled. "Good, that's good. But—" "I know," Vanessa interrupted, already anticipating her friend's warning. "It shouldn't take this much effort to be heard." A pause. Then Maya's voice softened. "It shouldn't." After they hung up, Vanessa returned to her laptop, taking in every bit of information she could find. She wasn't just doing this for herself anymore. She was thinking about her aunt, her mother, every woman she knew who had been dismissed, overlooked, and forced to fight for the medical care they deserved. A week later, Vanessa walked into the research clinic with her head held high. The lead doctor, a Black woman in her 50s, with a warm yet no-nonsense demeanor, listened to her concerns without interruption, asked detailed questions, ordered extensive tests. It was everything Dr. Carter hadn't done. 2 weeks after that, Vanessa had her answer. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't imagining things. She had a condition called systemic autoimmune disorder, treatable, but only if caught early. If she had waited, if she had accepted Carter's dismissive diagnosis, things could have gotten much worse. And that realization made her decision even clearer. Vanessa took a deep breath as she walked back into Dr. Carter's office. This time she wasn't asking for help. She was bringing the truth to his doorstep. The moment he stepped into the exam room, his expression flickered with mild surprise. "Miss Johnson?" His tone was the same as before, polite but distant, like he was already preparing to dismiss her. "I have my test results," she said, pulling out the documents from her bag, "and I'd like to discuss them with you." He hesitated before taking the papers. As his eyes moved across the medical jargon, his brow furrowed. "This is—" His voice trailed off. "Where did you get this diagnosis?" Vanessa crossed her arms. "From a specialist who actually listened to me." A silence stretched between them. She could see the gears turning in his head, the slow realization, the discomfort. "I see," he finally said, clearing his throat. "I may have overlooked some things." That was as close to an admission as she was going to get. Vanessa's voice remained steady. "You did, and that almost cost me critical time in getting the care I need." Dr. Carter shifted in his seat. "I assure you, it was never my intention to dismiss your concerns." "Maybe not," she said, "but intentions don't save lives. Action does." For the first time, he looked like he had nothing to say. Vanessa stood, gathering her papers. "I hope you remember this the next time a patient comes in with symptoms you don't immediately understand. I hope you ask better questions, because next time it could be someone who doesn't push back." Dr. Carter nodded slowly, still holding the papers. "You're right." And for the first time since she had walked into his office, she believed he meant it. Dr. Carter sat alone in his office after Vanessa left, her words ringing in his ears. "You almost cost me critical time in getting the care I need." He wasn't used to being questioned. He wasn't used to being wrong. And yet, the proof had been right there in his hands. Her condition had been real. Her concerns had been justified, and he had dismissed her just like so many other patients before her. For the first time in a long time, he felt something unfamiliar. Shame. He had always prided himself on being efficient, direct. But somewhere along the way he had stopped listening. Not just to Vanessa, but to countless other patients who had walked into his office, desperate for someone to believe them. And now he had a choice. The following week, Dr. Carter sat in a conference room at the hospital, surrounded by his colleagues. It was an educational seminar, something he had attended in the past but had never really engaged with. But today was different. The topic, racial disparities in healthcare. As the speaker detailed studies on how black patients' pain was often downplayed, how symptoms were overlooked, how medical bias, both conscious and unconscious, cost lives, Carter felt the weight of every decision he had made. Every patient he had waved off, every life he had failed to treat with the seriousness it deserved. Vanessa had been right. Intentions didn't save lives. When the seminar ended, he approached the speaker, an expert in patient advocacy. "I'd like to get involved," Carter said. "I need to do better." Over the next few months, Dr. Carter did just that. He started by changing the way he interacted with his patients, listening more, asking better questions, never assuming he had all the answers before they even spoke. He revisited cases he had once dismissed, called patients back in for reassessments, and even referred some to specialists. But that wasn't enough. He pushed for systemic changes in his clinic, advocating for more inclusive training, bringing in specialists to address biases, and challenging his colleagues to do the same. Some resisted, some scoffed, but he didn't care. He had seen firsthand what happened when doctors failed their patients. And he refused to be part of the problem anymore. One afternoon, months after Vanessa's visit, he received an email. "Doctor, I heard about the changes you're making. I hope it sticks, and I hope other doctors follow your lead. Because patients like me, we deserve better." Vanessa. He exhaled slowly, staring at the words. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't praise. But it was acknowledgement. And maybe, just maybe, it was a second chance to get things right. Dr. Carter sat in his office, watching the cursor blink on his screen. It had been 3 months since Vanessa Johnson walked into this very room, armed with evidence, forcing him to face the truth he had so easily ignored. The weight of that moment still sat heavy on his shoulders, but now, instead of guilt, there was something else. His inbox was filled with articles on medical bias, research on racial disparities in healthcare, and patient advocacy reports. It wasn't just theory anymore. It was real. It had always been real. He had just never taken the time to see it. The hospital board had approved new policies requiring doctors to undergo annual training on implicit bias and patient-centered care. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. And for the first time, Carter wasn't just a bystander in these changes. He was part of them. There was a knock at the door. "Come in," he said. His assistant, Lisa, stepped inside. "Your next patient is here." Carter glanced at the name on his schedule. Mrs. Evelyn Harris, 64 years old. Complaints of joint pain, fatigue, and shortness of breath. A few months ago, he would have skimmed over those symptoms, written them off as arthritis, maybe mild anemia. Today, he saw them for what they were. Red flags. "Send her in," he said. The elderly black woman walked in slowly, her cane tapping against the floor. She offered a polite nod as she took her seat. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Harris. Carter said, setting his clipboard aside. "Tell me what's been going on." She blinked as if surprised by the simple invitation. "Well, doctor, I've been feeling real tired lately. My hands swell up sometimes, and my knees ache something awful. I get these dizzy spells, too, and I keep getting this tightness in my chest. But my last doctor said it's probably just stress." Carter nodded, but he wasn't writing anything down yet. He was listening. "How long have you been experiencing this?" "Maybe 6, 7 months now." He leaned forward slightly. "Did your last doctor run any tests?" She hesitated. "He did some blood work, but he said everything looked fine. Told me to rest more and take some over-the-counter pain meds." Carter exhaled slowly, steadying himself. "Mrs. Harris, I'd like to run some additional tests today. I want to take a closer look at what's going on. I won't make any assumptions until we have more information, but I want to make sure we aren't missing anything important." She seemed taken aback. You really think it could be something serious?" "I think it's worth a thorough look, and I want you to know that whatever we find, we'll come up with a plan together." The corners of her mouth lifted slightly. "Thank you, doctor. I appreciate that." After she left, Carter sat back in his chair. The old version of himself, the one who had dismissed Vanessa, would have sent her home with generic advice and a prescription she didn't need. The new version? He ordered a full panel of tests, looking for underlying autoimmune conditions, inflammatory markers, and cardiac function. A few days later, the results confirmed what Carter had suspected. Mrs. Harris wasn't just dealing with mild arthritis or stress. She had early-stage lupus, an autoimmune disorder that, left untreated, could become life. The next time she came in, he explained everything to her with the patience and clarity he should have always offered his patients. He told her about treatment options, referred her to a specialist, and gave her a direct line to his office if she had any concerns. When she left, she looked at him and said, "You might have just saved my life, doctor." He didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. Later that evening, Carter found himself drafting an email to Vanessa. "Vanessa, I wanted to thank you for what you did. You forced me to see what I had refused to acknowledge. I thought being a good doctor meant knowing all the answers, but I've learned that being a great doctor means knowing how to listen. Because of you, I caught an early lupus diagnosis in a patient this week, one I would have missed before. I can't change the mistakes I've made, but I can make sure I never make them again. You were right. We have to do better. I have to do better, and I will. Carter." He hovered over the send button for a moment before clicking it. A week later, an email appeared in his inbox. "I appreciate you reaching out. I hope you stick to your word, because there are a lot of people depending on doctors like you to get this right. I wasn't just fighting for myself that day. I was fighting for every black woman who's been dismissed before me. Glad to hear you're finally listening. Let's hope others follow your lead. Vanessa." Carter sat back, reading the words over and over again. She was right. Again. This wasn't about him. It was about all the patients who deserved to be heard. And for the first time in his career, he understood that his legacy wouldn't be built on the cases he solved. It would be built on the lives he chose to listen to.